5, we are going to start talking about variables. So for your warm-up journal, and the question is, at the beginning of the course, we learned that input, output, storage, and processing were common to all computers. Where do you see input, output, storage, and processing in GameLab? I'm going to give you about a minute to think about an answer and put it in your journal. So an example of input would be the values that were passed as parameters. So when we started talking about filling a shape with color, the input would be green or blue. Also, typing into the GameLab workspace would be considered input. Output would be the shapes shown on the GameLab screen. Storage would be remembering the code. Processing would be the if, then, and matching that turn the code into the pictures on the screen. And in this lesson, we're going to focus on storage. We're going to look at variables, which are a very common way for computers to store information in a program. So our key term, which you should add to your vocab list in your journal, is variable. It is a label for a piece of information used in a program. Our question of the day, which you should be able to answer in your journal by the end of the lesson, is how can we use variables to store information in our programs? There is no activity guide for this lesson. It is just all going to be on code.org. So go ahead and go to Code Studio, Level 1, and again, this is Lesson 5. I want you to look at the 2 lines of code and predict where the circle will be drawn. Predict what will happen if you change the number in line 1, and then run the code to see what happens. Now, you will not be able to hit run until you make a prediction. So where will the circle be drawn? Let's look at this code. We've created a variable called xPosition, and xPosition has a value of 50. So everywhere in our program, wherever we see the term xPosition, we can just imagine the number 50 being there. So if we show our grid and we say x of 50 and a y of 350, x of 50, y of 350. So that's going to put it at the bottom left. The circle will be drawn at the bottom left. Okay. What will happen if you change the number in line 1? Well, if I changed the number to 350, then the value for this variable is 350. So that's the same as 350 being here and here. Changing the number in line 1 changes the value of the variable. Okay, so let's put it back to how it was so we can see if our first prediction is correct. And so it is. Now, you cannot change your prediction. It's okay if your prediction is off. One thing that we want to work on is being able to read code and make better predictions about what the code is going to do. So since these are our first predictions, it is fine if they are not exactly right. So hit finish and then continue. We are going to watch this video, and some questions to consider during the video are: what are variables used to do? How do you create a variable and assign it a value? What can go into a variable?
Most apps keep track of pieces of information that change and update as you use the app. For example, a simple game can keep track of your score and the number of lives you have left as you play. Apps utilize the computer's memory to do this, and learning how to use that memory when programming is a really powerful skill. The most common way to leverage a computer's memory is by creating a variable. Now, a variable is just a container for storing a value, and once created, the variable is stored in the computer's memory, and it can be used and updated repeatedly throughout your program. As an example, let's use variables to keep track of the score and the number of lives remaining in a hypothetical game. Creating the variable is really easy. You use the word var followed by a label that you want to give the variable. You can choose any label you want, but it helps to choose a word that describes the variable that you want to store. So let's label our first variable score to keep track of the score. And then we can create a second variable to keep track of lives. Remember these labels. You'll need them later in order to use the variables. We can assign a value to the variable using the equal sign, like this. Let's set our starting score to 0 and our number of lives to 3. Remember, you only need to use the var at the time that you want to create a new variable. A common mistake is to use it every single time you want to refer to a variable. Also, be sure to avoid mixing up the order when you call your variables. The label's got to appear on the left, and the value has to appear on the right, like this, not like this. Often, you'll want to create a variable and assign it a value right away. There's a really convenient way to do this with one line of code. This is sometimes called initializing the variable. It's important to realize that this single line of code is actually doing two things. First, creating the variable, and then second, assigning it a value. Let's take a moment to talk about the equal sign. In many coding languages, the equal symbol is called the assignment operator because you use it to assign a value to a variable. And you're probably used to seeing it in math, but in programming, it's a little bit different. If you were in math class and you saw this, something would definitely be wrong. Score can't possibly equal both 5 and 7, but this is not math class. With code, a computer is executing a set of instructions, one after the other. So this would just tell the computer to set score to 5, and then on the next line, set it to 7. In an effort to avoid confusion, programmers often don't use the word equals when we see this sign. Instead, they use the phrase gets the value. So when we see a statement like this, we could read it as score gets the value 7, or score gets 7 for short. Some programming languages avoid the confusion entirely by representing the assignment statements with a sideways arrow, like this. To use a variable, you just refer to it by its label. Anywhere the variable name appears in the program, the value currently stored in the variable will be retrieved from memory. The tricky part is that when using a variable, you often can't see visually what its value is. To bypass that problem, you can use console.log to display the value like this. This is a really handy trick, but remember there's a difference between showing the value of a variable and writing out the variable's label. When text appears in quotes, you're telling the computer to write those literal ASCII characters on the screen like this. But on the other hand, without quotes, the computer assumes that you're referring to a variable called score, and it will attempt to retrieve its value. If you haven't made that variable, then the computer will give an error.
So one thing that I want to make sure that you understand is that a variable holds information and can be accessed using that label. Okay, so let's look at levels 3 through 5. I will complete level 3 with you, and then we will see how you do on the rest of them. So, in which corner of the screen will the circle be drawn? Hint, click Show Grid, right? Okay, so if X position is 300, and then what's the Y is 100. See, it doesn't really matter what you name it. It makes more sense for the name to be related to whatever the value will contain, because then it's easier to understand. So if the X position is 300 and the Y position is 100, where will the ellipse be drawn? Approximately right here. It will be in the top right corner. Run. Top right corner. Okay, so I want you to work through levels 4 and 5 on your own. Remember, if you get stuck, try the help and tips and code documentation. One thing that we have learned is that in order to manipulate the information in here on an iPad, you have to use your arrow keys. Once you touch in the workspace, you are not able to manipulate any of the information there, so you'll have to refresh your page. And once the page refreshes, do not touch inside the workspace. Just use the arrow keys, okay? So, pause the video here so that you can finish levels 3 through 5. On level 6, I want you to complete each one of these. Practice your new skills on these levels. And once you have been able to complete them, then come back so we can move on to the next one. So pause the video here so you can complete the activities that are on level 6. Level 7 is your assessment level, and I want you to read the instructions. All right, make sure you read the instructions and make sure that you look at the rubric, because this is how you're going to be scored for this level, okay? Pause the video here so you can complete the assessment level 7. On level 8, I want you to choose at least one of these to complete, okay? The more challenges that you're able to complete, the more practice that you're going to get in coding, and the better that you're going to get in coding. And that is going to be it for your code.org activities. Your final journal is, what is your own definition of a variable, and why are variables useful in programs? So answer that in your journal. Pause it here so you can do that. And then also answer the question of the day. How can we use variables to store information in our programs? And that concludes lesson 5. So pause it if you need to type this question in your journal.